Hello again, it's Kyle Cordes with part 2, or video number 2 of a hopefully short series where I'm exploring using web components as the view layer in an Angular app. As a quick reminder, I'm not saying it's a good idea to use web components as a view layer in an Angular app because Angular is already fantastic for building its own view layer, but I'm using it to experiment with the following hypothesis. I think the next generation of frameworks is going to just delegate building the visual components to, pick your own web component library, and that this is going to allow the next generation of frameworks to really elevate, to shift their focus upward away from building components. So to get ready for that future, I'm experimenting with using Angular as my high-level framework and then some web component library as my low-level visual component framework. Now, for this video number 2, this will be the first experiment. So back in the back one video, I explained just this little example program. So in this first experiment, I'm going to use a thing called Svelte. If you've not heard of it, I think it is worth a look. It's sort of the most Angular-like of this very large set of numerous alternative, sort of smaller, more boutique web frameworks, single-page web app frameworks out there. It has some deep similarities with Angular, and I might go into that more in a future video. But for this one, I'm going to cover it in just barely enough depth to get through using it as our view layer. So, if you want to see the code, it's all in the same repo. And what I'm doing is I'm just going to develop each of these different ideas or different ways of using a different framework in a different branch. So I'm going to pick to this Svelte branch. Then I'm going to look at the commits. And that first commit is the code that was already shown in the last video. So everything I'm going to look at now is simply this commit. So I think what I'll do is I'll just briefly look through the commit here in the GitHub view and explain some changes, and then go look at that code a little bit more in Visual Studio Code, and then run it and see it in action. Okay, so just kind of stepping through in order here. There's a lot of kind of noise changes, but it's worth knowing about them if you're going to pick up Svelte and try to use it with Angular. So Svelte produces some bundles containing the compiled web components, if you're using it to build web components, which is not the only use it has, of course. In fact, it's really a secondary use. You don't want that bundled output to be checked in. You don't want that to that's not source code. But you do want to load it as a web asset, and so I'm sticking it in the source assets directory, but I don't want it to be picked up by Git, so I'm just telling Git to ignore it. Next, there is a Svelte plugin for VS Code. It has some rough edges. One of those rough edges is that you have to tell it where your node is. And that's real odd because I use dozens of other VS Code add-ons, and I don't think I have to tell any of the rest of those where my node is. So that hopefully that rough edge will go away. In terms of the package JSON, we pick up npm run all, and that is used so that the start command can use the run p, that's run parallel, that comes from npm run all, to do this view build and start dev. So start dev is just a rename of the Angular CLI dev process. And then view auto build, this is just performing an automatic build of my views. So I'm basically running two complete frameworks, or two different things side by side here, Svelte and Angular. I'm having the output of Svelte flow into the input of Angular, and so I have to simultaneously run both builds. It only took a few minutes to set up, and if you wanted to do that, you could copy off of this. But again, I'm not saying this is a good idea. I'm saying this is a great environment in which to experiment with the future. Okay. Svelte can be bundled in many different ways, but kind of the most obvious way is using Rollup. It has the advantage of, is that written by the same person? So you need Rollup, and you need a handful of related Rollup plugins to make it all work. There's some Rollup config. This only matters to you if you're a Rollup guru, if you're really interested in how the bundling works. There's really only one important setting, really only one non-default setting, is we are telling Svelte, I'm using Svelte because I want custom elements. So here's the switch to tell it to generate them. Next, we have to configure Angular to accept custom elements. And you do that by adding this thing called the custom element schema. If you've looked at Angular with Stencil or with Polymer, or with anything else with web components, you've probably seen the same edit made. And so you add that, then you list that as schemas in your module. And you have to do this for any module which is going to use your web components. Now in this tiny little Angular application, let me see, this is all the code for it is right, like this is the whole code for it. In this one, there's only one module, so I just edited this one module to use my custom element schema. Then you see I'm deleting some files. So if you looked at the last video, there were three components in here, there were 4 components. There was the app component, then there's employee list, then there were 2 view components. Those are both gone because I'm going to use Svelte to build my view components now. And so we look at the diff, we're just deleting some Angular components. Now, I only had to make one change to my Angular code, and that's just this one bit right here to use to have this employee list table view be a web component, a custom element, instead of having it be an Angular component. The reason I had to make this change is it's a very interesting little wrinkle of the Angular component model. In the Angular component model, one component can declare an output, and then the component containing it can receive that output, can catch that output. And when that happens, the Angular component emitting an output, it can emit anything. Any JavaScript value is fine. But custom elements, those have to live in the world of what's allowable in the browser. And the browser does not allow arbitrary things to be emitted as events. They have to be like a click event or I think it's a scroll event. There's about 300 events if you go look up the kind of the DOM documentation online. And if you want to do any other kind of event than one of the hundreds of built-in ones, they have a type called the custom event. So if you're doing your own event, like in this I had an event called select ID, this is going to be a custom event. And a custom event, $event is going to be of type custom event, and then any kind of payload will have to be hanging off of that custom event, which means that code like this in Angular won't work if the thing being referenced is a custom element, because that custom element, when it emits things, they're always going to be events of some kinds. And so if you need some data, you're going to have to stick that data in a field like I did here. But still, I was very pleased that this 7 characters, this is the only edit I had to make my Angular code, to make this kind of top-level Angular code use a couple of custom elements instead of a couple of Angular components. We'll see that in a minute. Next, on my page, I need to bring in my bundled CSS and JavaScript for my views. There's 4 or 5 ways to do this, but this way was quite trivial, just a couple of lines of edit. Then here I am adding the Svelte code. We'll go look at this in the VS Code IDE in a moment and explain just enough Svelte to make sense of it. So that's it. That's the entire edit. It's not a very big edit. Here we go. So from an Angular point of view, again, compared to the base code, I simply deleted 2 components. Then I made a trivial edit to this component because I had to take the data I was emitting and put that as the payload of an event instead of just emitting the data directly, like I could in Angular. So that tiny little edit and then some deletion, no big deal. Then I just made this next part up. There's nothing official here. I just decided I would make a top-level views directory, and here's where I would put my Svelte components. Now I happen to name these .svelte. You could also name them .html. There's a lot of rough edges in the Svelte tooling as I record this in August 2018. So apparently because I have TypeScript in here, or maybe this is just a defect that's always there, but in my project anyway, I'm getting a bunch of erroneous help from the Svelte tooling. Like it's telling me that it's complaining that in my JavaScript code that I have something that's implicitly of type any, but this is JavaScript code. Like there's an open question in this Svelte world of how is it going to someday be possible to write TypeScript code here? But right now this is JavaScript code, so you absolutely cannot do this, right? You can't do this because it's it's JavaScript code, and yet I'm stuck with these silly errors complaining about it as if it was TypeScript code. So again, there's rough edges. I'm ignoring these rough edges because I'm assuming that they have to do with, kind of very early days Svelte tooling, plus the combination that I've just sort of mashed this into my Angular project. So I'm going to ignore these red squigglies, something we would normally not recommend. Okay, so just a very brief summary of what I had to do to program these in Svelte. So I had pointed my rollup configuration to say here's the starting point, here's like the file I need. And so I made an index.js file. I made that simply import the Svelte component. So I have two Svelte view components. They're both single file components, as you can see, and I just had to write a single line import. There's magic going on here, right? Like .Svelte, that's not like a type that JavaScript knows about, but because of this rollup thing with the Svelte plugin, there's all sorts of not quite magic that can happen there to make it possible to compile this thing here, right? This isn't a JavaScript file, and it's kind of an HTML file, but no, not really. It's really a Svelte file. And there's tooling to make that possible to do this single file component. If you've ever looked at Vue, for example, Vue does the exact same thing. They use a custom plugin for whatever bundler you're using, be that Rollup or Webpack or whatever, to understand Vue's single file component syntax. So like Vue, Svelte has a single file component syntax, and here is a very simple one. So the Angular code that this compares to, let's go bring that up over here. So here's the employee detail component, HTML and TypeScript. So here's the Angular code that went away. Make that a little bigger. So here's the Angular code that went away, these two files, replaced by this file. So to point to some interesting differences, over in Angular, I have this syntax, right? This is the syntax that says, if this thing is null or undefined or in some other way not an object, then don't attempt to traverse inside it. Don't throw an error because it has no first name field. And that's a very convenient feature of Angular. So far, there's nothing like that in Svelte. So in Svelte, if when I had employee.firstname, if employee was ever undefined or null, then I would get errors in my console, and I had to work around that manually in Svelte. I had to put an if employee around the outside. Now, it's still not quite right, because in the Angular one, it would still show all the structure just with maybe the first name missing. And I think if I wanted to do that, I'd have to do really much more tedious Svelte. I could, go in here and do something like this, write an if around each one or something. I chose not to do that. There's also other ways I could tackle this in Svelte. I could make a computed value in Svelte, like a computed employee that was never undefined. So there are ways around this. I just chose to keep it simple. So other little nuances. In Angular code, you have to explicitly declare your inputs, but in Svelte, you just start using a local variable name, and that is just assumed to be an input of this component. And that has pluses and minuses. It certainly is more concise than what I have with Angular. The minus is that, if I just misspelled employee here, a certain spot, I wouldn't get any kind of compiler error or warning. It would just not work at runtime. So there's some trade-offs there around types and declarations and explicitness. Other trade-offs. A really nice thing I found is that, really a lot of components are almost entirely visual layout, especially Vue components. Again, going back to the gist of my experiment here, I'm experimenting with different ways to do Vue components. And for a Vue component, and that's like VIEW, not VUE, but for a Vue component, a presentational component, certainly, I think it really makes a great deal of sense what Svelte does, where you simply launch immediately into the template part of your component. Like there's no prefix. So, I didn't have to I didn't have to write that. I didn't have to write, I didn't have to do anything to say, first I'm going to give you the layout of my component, because And that's kind of the whole point of a Svelte component, is that it has layout. And so there is no prefix. There's 0 lines of code of boilerplate to jump straight into the presentation layout. Other interesting trade-offs. So Angular really goes out of its way. Let me see if I can find an example. Goes out of its way to put things like for, to have those sort of hide inside the HTML syntax. And I think the history of that with Angular is that in the early days of Angular, they were actually using the browser to parse this right here. And then they eventually moved to their own parser to parse this. But because they started in the early days using the browser to parse it, that like put a lot of pressure on the design of Angular to make all of the Angularisms basically hide inside the HTML syntax. Vue never does that. Vue, they have their own code that parses their template to produce a program that produces HTML. And so they very intentionally went the other direction with this and this for the if markers. Here, I'll bring up my other Vue component. So with this each is equivalent to this ng4 right here, but the each is intentionally starkly different from HTML syntax, and the ng4 is intentionally hiding within HTML syntax. I think there are interesting merits of both approaches. I'm so familiar with the Angular approach by now that even without great IDE support for it, even if I didn't have that, I can still just immediately spot the Angularisms in a template. But I kind of wonder if this Svelte approach might be easier to learn and teach to, say, a non-programmer design staff, because it's very, very obvious in Svelte which things are trying to be HTML and which things are trying to be, like the equivalent of an Angular structural directive. So I think there is some merit to this Svelte approach of making the syntax more different, of not trying to hide within. Okay, more comparison. Here's a click event in Angular, right? And so if you're familiar with Angular, the way that you emit an event is you declare an output, and you have to kind of manually initialize it to an event emitter. It's a little bit ugly. And then when you're ready to emit it in say, a click handler, you just take the name of that variable that you defined for your output. By the way, this name by default becomes the name of the event. And so you just take that and you call emit on it. So you can also call next if you want. So it's very easy. It's very short. Let's see how this looked in Svelte. So in Svelte, they have something very, very similar called Fire. But Fire does not really work if you're doing web components in Svelte. This is a little bit of a rough edge in Svelte. As of now, if you want to emit an event from a web component, so that it can be used by something that's hosting the web component, you have to do this kind of manual thing where you call this, so this is the way you get a reference to kind of the component itself, and you call dispatch event, and then you have to kind of manually, one by one here, create a custom event. So this is a browser thing right here. This is not a Svelte thing. This is a browser thing called a custom event, and then you have to kind of, shove some name and value stuff in it. I chose to wrap that up in what Svelte calls a method. I named it _emit. And then I just called that up here so that I could get this line of code is now almost the same as this line of code. Now we can just point out the syntactical differences. Again, Angular has this, I think, really nice convention if you put the round parens to kind of capture any event. Svelte has a different convention. You say on, and then you can capture any event. And then in Angular, this is the syntax for emitting the event, upward to the containing component. In Svelte, this is the syntax, with my helper method. By the way, one more wrinkle here. Svelte does not have a notion of private methods, so I just made up this underscore convention. I don't think that's a real convention, but I don't want this method to ever be called by a user of this web component. I just wanted a place to write some code to the call from up here, and so I kind of wish there was some way of saying privates or private methods or something. But in any event, it's just a different syntax, but it's almost identical. Next, here this is how we set the background color in Angular. So what I said is that if the employee that we're listing, this component, if you've forgotten, this is looping over the list of employees in that program. Here, I'll bring the program back up. It's looping over this list of employees right here. And I think I was looking at the Angular code first. If the employee ID we're looping over equals the one that's selected, then we make the background yellow. Otherwise, we don't. And so this is kind of the Angular syntax for that. And it took just a few minutes to figure out the Svelte syntax for that. It's a little bit different. I'm sort of handling style as a string here, so it's maybe not quite as nice. If I was juggling multiple styles, this would be a little bit uglier. The Angular syntax is really quite slick because you can manipulate as many styles as you want, and they won't break a sort of a plain HTML style tag, whereas that would happen here. Here I'm like explicitly setting the HTML style. So I'd say the Angular mechanism for binding to styles seems to be a little more well developed, well polished than the Svelte one. But it wasn't bad. I got it to work almost right away. Okay, so I think that is everything. So I made these two components, these two single file components, those replaced two, if I can find them, two Angular components that were 2 files each. So 4 files became 2 files. I had just a couple of files that kind of fixed overhead for this experiment to be able to bring in all the Svelte I needed. I had this one bit of fixed overhead because of this oddity around how events emitted from Svelte components don't just work as web component custom elements. You have to do this little bit of extra work. But again, this didn't take very long to figure out. Special thanks to help I got on the Discord channel, by the way. Okay, so what else can I observe about this approach? Well, I intentionally didn't do like performance testing or size testing because I didn't want to spend any more time than I absolutely had to just getting up and running to understand the trade-offs. And I would say that in terms of the trade-offs, it was pretty easy. It took a little getting used to the Sveltisms of how this list right here is not declared. Like you can just start using it. But that's kind of a difference of a Svelte component and Angular component. Other than learning a couple rough edges, which I think really I've hit like most of the rough edges that exist, I think I could pretty straightforwardly, crank through 50 Angular Vue components and write them as web components instead. Now again, my first experiment platform here I've chosen is Svelte. I'm going to do the same thing with a couple of others, and I'm expecting to have similar results. But overall, I would say I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. Like just doing the high-level work here in Angular, and then most of the low-level work in web components. So I think my hypothesis is so far reasonably well supported by this experiment. I did want to try to do one little experiment live, and then point out one more rough edge. So let's take a look here. What I want to know is how big is the Vue code, the Svelte code, and here it is. This is in development mode, it's 16K. So in development mode, it's really unnecessarily large. I think I could do a build. Let me see if I can bring this online. Let's find out how big that Vue bundle is when I'm doing a production build. And look, the Svelte part for the Vue components took just a fraction of a second. The Angular build's not too bad, but it's definitely longer. In fact, here, let me get ready to get an output here as soon as it becomes ready. I guess I could have used another window here or not done the Angular build. Here we go. Let's just bring up another tab so we can get the show on the road here. So when compiled with production mode, those 2 Vue components total 6K. And that's 6K with no other support files needed. Everything needed to make those web components work is fully bundled in there. So that's pretty nice. I feel like that should handle like quite large applications if you just a few K per Vue component. Okay, then only one more thing to cover here. So web component custom elements. There's a lot of discussion about whether they should use a thing called Shadow DOM. Shadow DOM is this amazing new technology. It's not that new. It might not be that amazing, but it's this amazing new technology that creates isolation between like the code and the CSS and HTML inside a component versus outside of a component. And it has the effect of stopping the CSS you write inside your component from leaking out and affecting your application. It also has the effect of stopping the CSS you write in your application from leaking in and affecting your web component. And so you'll notice that compared to the last video, you can go back and watch that, this is a very sparse appearance. This table is not a styled table, and this detail is not a styled detail view. That's because my application level CSS, which I think is like materialized or something, doesn't really matter, it doesn't leak into these web components. Now, there are, I could probably name at least a dozen different tools for building custom elements with, and most of those have a switch of whether you want to use Shadow DOM or not. As of this moment, Svelte does not have that switch. It always uses Shadow DOM. And I was curious if I'd be able to solve the problem of getting these styled, but I thought I would defer that because I figured it's going to take a half an hour just to explain everything I've done so far. So maybe in some future video, we'll try to style these in spite of Shadow DOM. But that's definitely a thing to keep in mind if you're looking at Svelte for custom elements. Is if you're hoping to turn Shadow DOM off, as of right now, there is not yet a way to do that. So you're stuck with kind of restyling each custom element from scratch. And that certainly can be done. I just didn't take the time to do it here. So, okay, well, thank you for watching. I guess the usual plea, subscribe if you want to catch the next one. I'm planning to experiment with a few more different ways of doing my view components with Angular. Again, always returning to this hypothesis, not because it's a good idea, but because it's a way to work on like understanding this hypothesis. And thanks for watching. See you on the next one.